Bryn Sunderland slid her phone across the table of a quiet bar in Asheville, North Carolina, and on the screen was a photo of her younger sister Noelle Sunderland, CEO of a billion-dollar real estate empire, sharp jawline, sharper eyes, the kind of woman who made boardrooms go silent just by walking in. Bryn grinned. "I dare you. One dinner with my little sister." Graham Aldrich looked at the photo, then looked down at his own hands, calloused, cracked at the knuckles, stained with machine oil that never fully washed out. The hands of a maintenance worker. "She won't want to sit at the same table as me," he said. Bryn tilted her head, and her voice dropped. "You don't even know who you are anymore, Graham," he agreed. "Just one dinner." But that dinner didn't end with flowers or a kiss. It ended with a 52-story tower on the verge of collapse, a secret worth millions, and the most powerful woman in the city discovering that the man she had just dismissed was the only person who could save everything. It started as a dare, but what Graham Aldrich carried beneath those calloused hands was about to shake everything Noelle Sunderland had ever built. If your best friend dared you to go on a blind date with someone way out of your league, would you say yes? 2 days before that night at the bar, Graham Aldrich woke at 5:45 in a small apartment on the east side of Asheville. The place was clean but sparse, mismatched furniture, a bookshelf heavy with engineering manuals he never let anyone see, and a framed photograph on the top shelf, turned face down. He had placed it that way 3 years ago and never turned it back. He moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of a man who had done the same thing 1,000 mornings in a row. Coffee, toast, a glass of milk set at the edge of the counter for small hands. Josie came padding out of her bedroom in socks that were too big, dragging a sketchbook that was almost as wide as her shoulders. She was 7 years old, with tangled hair and her mother's pale green eyes, and she climbed onto the kitchen stool without a word, opened the sketchbook, and began drawing. Graham glanced over. She was sketching a tall building, wobbly lines, bright crayon colors, but the proportions were surprisingly close. "Daddy, does this look like the ones you draw in your notebook?" she asked without looking up. Graham studied the drawing. A faint smile crossed his face. "It does, but you need a support column right here." He pointed to a spot near the base. Josie giggled and added a thick purple line. "There, now it won't fall down." He kissed the top of her head and turned away. Before she could see the shift in his expression, a flicker of something between pride and grief that crossed his face so fast it barely existed at all. Hardering intrual 20 minutes later. Her teacher, a kind woman in her 50s named Mrs. Carmichael, caught Graham at the door. "Mr. Aldrich, Josie turned in her assignment yesterday. What does your daddy do for work? She drew you as an architect." She even wrote the word architect across the top in big letters. Graham paused for a beat too long. "She has a big imagination," he said, and walked away before the conversation could go further. He didn't look back, but his jaw tightened as he crossed the parking lot. By 7:30, Graham was at the Ridgeline Commercial Complex on the south side of the city, a mid-rise office park, where he served as the head of maintenance. His co-workers called him Fix-It Graham. He never corrected them. He never corrected anyone about anything. He spent the morning replacing a failing compressor in the HVAC system on the 3rd floor, moving with a quiet precision that his colleagues mistook for routine competence. When the hallway emptied after lunch, Graham stopped in front of a construction blueprint pinned to the wall near the service elevator. His eyes moved across the schematic the way a conductor reads a score, not searching but understanding. Every load path, every stress point, every margin of error. He reached out and traced a line on the drawing with his finger, then pulled his hand back as if the paper had burned him. He saw the language inside the lines, because he had once written that language himself. That evening, his phone rang. Bryn Sunderland, his oldest friend, the woman who had known him since their freshman year at Virginia Tech, before the career, before the marriage, before the silence that swallowed everything after. Bryn was loud where Graham was quiet, relentless where he was withdrawn, and she had never once respected a boundary he tried to set. "My little sister just got dumped again," Bryn announced. 3 weeks, new record. "You need to meet her." Graham leaned against the kitchen counter. "I don't date, Bryn. Tonight. The usual bar. Just give me 10 minutes to make my case." He looked across the room at Josie, asleep on the couch with her sketchbook clutched against her chest, a half-finished drawing of a bridge visible beneath her arm. He should have said no, He always said no, but something in the stillness of that apartment, the face-down photograph, the 2 quiet evenings, the way his daughter drew buildings and called him an architect, as if she remembered a life he had tried to erase, made him reach for his jacket and close the door quietly behind him. The next morning, while Graham was tightening a valve in an underground utility corridor, Noelle Sunderland stood on the 40th floor of the Sunderland Development Corp headquarters in downtown Asheville, looking out through floor-to-ceiling glass at a city she intended to reshape. She was 33 years old, composed, precise, and unforgiving in every room she entered. The conference table behind her seated 9 board members and 3 senior vice presidents, and not one of them had spoken in the last 40 seconds because Noelle had just asked a question that exposed a gap in the quarterly projections, and no one wanted to be the first to admit it existed. The question was about Sunderland Pinnacle, a 52-story commercial tower on the north end of the city, the largest project in the company's history, and the centerpiece of everything the Sunderland name was supposed to represent. Phase 1 was scheduled for its gala, unveiling in 2 weeks. Everything was on track. Everything was on budget. Reed Kavanaugh, the company's senior vice president, and the man who had overseen Pinnacle's construction from foundation to facade, stood at the far end of the table and delivered his progress report with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed every syllable in front of a mirror. Timelines met. Inspections passed. Costs contained. Noelle nodded, but something flickered behind her eyes as she scanned the budget summary. It was too clean, too smooth, the kind of perfection that only existed when someone had carefully sanded away every rough edge. That evening, Bryn arranged the dinner. She chose a restaurant on Lexington Avenue, candlelight, white tablecloths, the kind of place that expected a certain caliber of guest. Graham arrived first, wearing a simple button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, his hands scrubbed but still showing the permanent calluses of years of manual labor. He sat at the table and didn't touch the menu. Noelle arrived 15 minutes late, her heels clicking against the hardwood with a rhythm that sounded like authority. She sat down, ordered sparkling water without looking at the waiter, glanced at Graham the way someone glances at furniture that has been placed in the wrong room, and turned to Bryn. "This is the person you mentioned?" The dinner lasted 53 minutes. Noelle was polite but visibly unimpressed. She asked Graham what he did for a living. He said, "Maintenance." The silence that followed was long enough to hear the candle flicker. Noelle looked at Bryn with an expression that carried the weight of a question and an accusation at the same time. Midway through the meal, Noelle's phone buzzed a technical issue at the Pinnacle construction site, a drainage leak in the basement level, creating a pressure differential in the foundation support system. She spoke to her assistant in clipped sentences, issuing orders for an immediate repair, using terms she had learned from Reed's reports without fully understanding them. Graham, sitting across the table with a glass of water he hadn't touched, tilted his head slightly when he heard the description. The tilt was barely perceptible, just a fractional shift in the angle of his attention, but Bryn caught it, and something sad passed through her eyes, because she knew exactly what that tilt meant. It meant Graham's mind had already begun solving a problem no one had asked him to solve. The evening ended coldly. Noelle pulled Bryn aside near the coat check. "Don't set me up again, Bryn. I don't have time for someone with no ambition." Bryn watched Graham walk to his truck in the parking lot, hands in his pockets, shoulders straight, disappearing into the dark without a single word of complaint. She whispered under her breath, "You have no idea what you just walked away from, little sister." 2 days later, a coincidence delivered Graham directly into Noelle's world. His maintenance company had been contracted to service the HVAC system in the technical floor of the Sunderland Pinnacle construction site. He entered through a side door in his standard-issue uniform gray coveralls, tool belt, company badge clipped to his chest. Nobody looked at him twice. To every person on that site, he was invisible, just another pair of hands sent to fix something that someone more important had noticed was broken. Noelle was on site that morning, leading a group of foreign investors on a walkthrough of the partially completed lower floors. She moved through the unfinished corridors with the confidence of someone who owned every square inch of concrete beneath her feet, narrating the building's design philosophy, its engineering innovations, its projected return on investment. She was magnetic. This was where Noelle Sunderland was at her best, turning steel and glass into a story that made powerful people reach for their checkbooks. Graham was crouched in a corridor on the 16th floor, checking a duct connection behind an access panel, when the tour group turned the corner. Noel saw him and faltered for exactly 1 second. The man from dinner, on his knees with a wrench. Reed Kavanaugh, walking beside her in a tailored suit, spotted Graham and raised his voice loud enough for every investor to hear. Who authorized a maintenance worker in the investor tour zone? Then he turned to Noel with a half-smile that carried a knife inside it. Noel, is this the boyfriend Bryn set you up with? The investors looked at Graham, his coveralls, his tool belt, the grease on his forearms. Noel felt the weight of their attention shift, and in that instant, she made a calculation, the kind that prioritized perception over truth. He's a maintenance worker, she said, her voice even and cold. He has nothing to do with me. Security, please escort him to the appropriate area. Graham didn't argue. He didn't flinch. He folded his tools into his belt, stood, and turned to leave. But before he stepped away, he paused for 3 full seconds and looked up at a steel joint connection in the corner of the ceiling where 2 structural beams met. His eyes narrowed. Something about the weld pattern, the gauge of the beam, the angle of the bracket, something was wrong. He studied it the way a doctor studies an X-ray that shows a fracture no one else has noticed. Then he walked away without a word. Reed watched him go. The smile on Reed's face died fast, because Graham had looked directly at the one section Reed knew had been built with inferior materials. That evening, Graham sat on the edge of Josie's bed. She was already under the covers, arms wrapped around a stuffed rabbit with one missing ear, fighting sleep the way she did every night with stubbornness and slow blinks. "Daddy, are you sad?" she asked. Graham smoothed her hair. "No, sweetheart. Just thinking." Josie yawned and turned her face into the pillow. "When I'm sad, I draw." "You should draw too, Daddy." He smiled, kissed her forehead, and stayed in the doorway until her breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep. After she was out, Graham opened his old laptop at the kitchen table and pulled up the publicly available construction permits for Sunderland Pinnacle, filed with the Buncombe County Building Department, accessible to anyone who knew where to look. He studied the structural specifications in the original design submission and compared them to what he had seen on the construction site that morning. The numbers didn't match. The steel joint he had noticed the weld pattern, the beam gauge was below the specification listed in the approved design. Someone had changed the materials after the plans were approved. Graham leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He hadn't wanted to see it. He hadn't wanted any of this. But seeing was the one thing he had never been able to stop doing. The next day, an unrelated crisis proved what Graham already knew about himself. A fire suppression system on the 4th floor of the Ridgeline complex malfunctioned, triggering a full evacuation of the office building. The building's technical team spent 2 hours trying to isolate the fault, cycling through every diagnostic in the manual without success. Alarms were blaring. Tenants were standing in the parking lot. The property manager was on the phone with the fire department. Graham walked past the commotion, studied the system diagram mounted on the wall for less than a minute, and pointed to an auxiliary pressure valve on the secondary loop. "Reverse this valve," he said. "The backflow is creating pressure in a dead zone between the 3rd and 4th floor junctions." The lead technician looked at him with open skepticism. Pressure dead zones were a concept that belonged to systems design, not field repair, the kind of thing taught in graduate-level engineering courses, not maintenance certification programs. But they were out of options. They reversed the valve. The system came back online within 30 seconds. Noel happened to be in the building that day. Sunderland Corp leased an entire floor of the Ridgeline complex as temporary office space for the Pinnacle project team. She was standing in the corridor when the alarm stopped, and she watched Graham walk away from the panel while 3 technicians stood in silence behind him, staring at the system as if they couldn't understand what had just happened. She didn't say anything, but the expression on her face shifted a crack in the wall of dismissal. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't trust. It was the first, reluctant acknowledgement that something about this man didn't add up. Back in her temporary office, she pulled Graham's personnel file from the building management system. Graham Aldrich, maintenance supervisor, hired 2 years ago. No advanced technical certifications, no engineering degree on record, no prior employment in any design or construction firm. Nothing, absolutely nothing that explained how a man who fixed air conditioners for a living understood pressure dead zones in fire suppression systems. She closed the file. But she didn't close the question. An hour later, a senior engineer from a partner firm arrived to inspect the system post-incident. He asked the technicians who had resolved the fault. They pointed down the hall toward Graham, who was already packing up his tools at the service elevator. The engineer walked over and studied Graham for a long moment. "Where did you learn about pressure dead zones? That's systems design knowledge. That's not maintenance." Graham turned, met the man's eyes with a gaze that carried no defensiveness and no explanation, and said, "I read a lot." Then he picked up his toolbox and walked away. The engineer stood motionless. The three technicians behind him didn't move. The entire corridor went silent, filled with the weight of a question that no one in that building could answer. 1 week before the gala unveiling, Graham sat at his kitchen table after midnight, surrounded by printouts and handwritten calculations. He had spent every evening since the construction site visit cross-referencing the public building permits with the photographs he had taken during his brief time inside Pinnacle. The evidence was undeniable. The steel used in floors 30 through 42 was at least 2 grades below the specification in the original structural design. Someone had substituted cheaper materials after the city approved the plans, and the substitution had been done carefully. The dimensions matched, the appearance was similar, but the tensile strength and load-bearing capacity were fundamentally inadequate. Graham ran the load calculations 3 times. Under normal conditions, calm weather, standard occupancy, the building would hold, but in a Category 3 hurricane, the kind that struck the southeastern United States with regularity, the wind load on the upper floors would exceed the capacity of the inferior steel. The structure would deform. Connection points would fail. Floors could buckle. Walls could shear apart. People could die. He picked up his phone and called Bryn. His voice was steady, but Bryn had known him for nearly 20 years, and she heard what that steadiness cost him. "I need to see Noelle," he said. "Not about dinner. Not about anything personal. This is about the building. It's serious." Bryn didn't ask questions. She heard in his voice something she had only heard once before the night he had called to tell her his wife was gone. She arranged the meeting within the hour. Graham met Noelle at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the Sunderland offices. He placed a single sheet of paper on the table, handwritten structural analysis, comparing the approved design specifications to the materials he had observed on site. He pointed to the discrepancy. He explained the risk in simple, precise language, the way a man explains something he has lived inside for decades. Noelle looked at the paper, then looked at Graham. Her expression hardened. "You're a maintenance worker," she said. "What could you possibly know about the structural integrity of a 52-story building?" Graham held her gaze. "I know enough to know that building isn't safe." Noelle didn't believe him. She thought he was trying to impress her, or worse, sabotage the project to prove some kind of point. She picked up her phone and called Reed from the table, right in front of Graham, and asked about the materials. Reed's voice came through the speaker, calm and rehearsed. Everything was up to code. Every inspection had passed. Every beam had been certified. He paused, then added a warning. "Be careful with outsiders who have agendas, Noelle. Some people will say anything to get close to power." Noelle ended the call and stood up. "Don't contact me about this again. If you continue, I'll treat it as harassment." She walked out without looking back. Graham sat alone at the table for a long time. He looked down at the paper. The calculations stared back at him, cold, correct, and ignored. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. That same afternoon, Reed learned that Graham had spoken to Noelle about the building. He made one phone call to Marcus Hale, the project's chief structural engineer. His instructions were simple and final. Lock all construction site access for external maintenance personnel. No exceptions. Effective immediately. Graham's site credentials were deactivated within the hour. Every door he could have used to enter the Pinnacle construction site was now closed. But Graham Aldrich had never been the kind of man who stopped when a door closed. He found another way through. He located Marcus Hale in the underground parking garage of the Pinnacle office annex, after hours, when the lot was nearly empty. Marcus was a 50-year-old man, with deep circles under his eyes, and a tremor in his hands that hadn't been there 6 months ago. He saw Graham approaching, and his entire body stiffened. "I can't talk to you," Marcus said, his voice raw. "You don't understand what's happening here." Graham kept his voice level and low. "I understand exactly what's happening. You know the materials were switched. You know the structure won't hold under wind load. And you're afraid, because Reed has something on you." Marcus said nothing. His eyes reddened, his keys jangled in his shaking hand. Graham continued, each word placed with surgical care. "But if that building comes down with people inside it, you'll carry that for the rest of your life. You know that. I know that. That's why I'm here." Marcus broke. He spoke in fragments, his voice barely above a whisper. Reed had presented the material substitution as a cost optimization routine, harmless, well within margins. Marcus had signed the approval documents under pressure, and Reed had kept those signed documents as leverage. If Marcus spoke up, the signatures would prove he had authorized the change. He would lose his engineering license, his career, possibly his freedom. "He has everything stored on the project management system," Marcus whispered. "The original purchase orders, the substitution records, the falsified inspection certificates, all of it. Encrypted folder on his office computer at the construction site, only accessible from that terminal." Graham asked one question. "Can I get to it?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "Your access has been revoked. You can't even get past the front gate." Graham went to Bryn that same night. He told her the truth, not about his past, not about who he used to be, but about the danger. The steel was wrong. The building was unsafe. Thousands of people would be at risk the moment the tower was fully occupied. Bryn sat across from him in her living room and listened without interrupting. She didn't understand the engineering. She didn't need to. She understood Graham. In all the years she had known him, through college and marriage and loss and silence, she had never once heard him ask for help. He was asking now. She used her status as a member of the Sunderland family to arrange Graham's entry to the construction site during a pre-gala family walkthrough scheduled for the following afternoon. Noelle found out within hours. She called Bryn, her voice vibrating with controlled fury. "You brought him into my building. You're undermining my company, Bryn." "My company?" Bryn's answer was quiet, but carried a weight that made Noelle pause. "If someone is undermining your company, sweetheart, it's not the person you think." The line went silent. For the first time in their lives, the two sisters were standing on opposite sides of a line that neither of them had drawn. Inside the Pinnacle construction site, Graham moved quickly. He found Reed's temporary office on the 32nd floor and sat down at the project management terminal. He didn't hack anything. He didn't force any locks. He navigated the system the way a surgeon navigates a body because he had used this exact software platform thousands of times during his years at Thornfield Engineering. He knew the directory structure, the naming conventions, the default log paths for material change orders, the original steel purchase orders specifying grade 60 steel. The substitution orders placed 3 months later for grade 40 from a discount supplier in Alabama. Internal emails between Reed and the supplier, negotiating a price that was $4.2 million below the approved budget. Falsified inspection certificates bearing Reed's digital signature, and a shell company registered in Delaware under Reed Kavanaugh's name that had received the difference in 3 separate wire transfers. Graham photographed every screen with his phone. 47 images. Real evidence, real data, enough to bring down a career, save a building, and prove that a maintenance worker had been right all along. When he stepped out of the office, Reed Kavanaugh was standing in the corridor, arms folded, face pale with controlled rage. The two men looked at each other across 10 feet of unfinished concrete, and Reed understood instantly what had happened. "Who do you think you are?" Reed said, his voice flat and dangerous. "You're a maintenance worker who just broke into a restricted office. I can have you arrested in the next 5 minutes." He pulled out his phone and called security. 2 guards arrived and took Graham by the arms. Then Reed called Noelle. "The man your sister brought in just trespassed into my private office at the construction site. I have security footage. How would you like to handle this?" Noelle arrived within the hour. She walked into the corridor and saw Graham standing between 2 security guards, his expression perfectly calm, his hands still at his sides. Reed stood 3 steps away, presenting his case with the polish of a man who had spent his career making accusations sound like concerned trespassing, possible corporate espionage, a coordinated attempt to undermine the Pinnacle project before the gala. Graham said nothing while Reed spoke. He simply waited, the way a man waits who knows exactly what he's holding and exactly when to show it. Noelle looked at Graham. Her voice was ice. Do you have anything to say? Graham met her eyes, and for the first time he didn't look down, didn't step aside, didn't defer to her authority or her title. He looked at her the way an equal looks at another equal. Test the steel on floor 35, he said. Use the specifications from the original design you submitted to the Buncombe County Building Department. Compare them to the actual material installed on site. If they match, I'll turn myself in to the police right now. The silence in that corridor lasted 6 full seconds. No one moved. No one breathed. Reed spoke quickly. Don't listen to him, Noel. This is a stunt designed to. Noel raised one hand and cut him off mid-sentence. She didn't look at Reed. She was looking at Graham, at the stillness in his posture, the absence of fear in his eyes, the way he stood between 2 security guards, as if they weren't even there. There was no pleading, no desperation, no performance, just certainty. Open your office, Reed, Noel said. Reed's composure cracked for the first time. Noel, this is completely. She turned to him, and her voice dropped to a register that no one in the corridor had ever heard from her before. I said open it. Now, for the first time in her career, Noelle Sunderland chose to doubt her own system instead of doubting the man standing in front of her. Noelle brought in an independent structural engineering team within 48 hours. They tested the steel on floor 35. They tested floors 31, 37, and 40. The results were unanimous and devastating. The material was 2 full grades below the load-bearing specification in the original approved design. The structural integrity of floors 30 through 42 fell below the minimum safety threshold for a building of that height and classification in a wind load zone. The report used the word critical 4 times in its first page. Noelle convened an emergency meeting in the main boardroom of Sunderland Corp headquarters. Every seat was filled. The full board of directors, Reed Kavanaugh, the construction engineering team, outside legal counsel, and Graham Aldrich, who sat at the far end of the table in the same button-down shirt he had worn to dinner, his calloused hands resting flat on the polished wood. Reed arrived with his composure, mostly intact, though his eyes drifted toward the door 3 times in the first 2 minutes. He had prepared his defense: supply chain error, vendor miscommunication, a system glitch that had caused the wrong materials to be logged. When Noelle opened the meeting by presenting the independent engineering report, the room went silent. Reed leaned forward. This is a supply chain failure, he said. I'm as much a victim here as anyone in this room. Noelle turned to Graham. Mr. Aldrich. Graham stood. He opened a laptop and walked the room through the evidence, piece by piece, with the calm authority of a man who had spent his career making buildings stand. The material change order logs time-stamped, tagged with Reed's personal login credentials. The emails to the discount steel supplier written by Reed, specifying the lower-grade alloy by catalog number. The falsified inspection certificates bearing Reed's digital signature with metadata, showing they had been created 6 weeks after the actual inspection date. The $4.2 million discrepancy routed through a shell company in Delaware, registered under Reed Kavanaugh's name. Reed's face went white. He turned on Graham, and his voice cracked for the first time. Who authorized a maintenance worker to speak in this room? He has no credentials, no engineering license, no standing whatsoever. This is a farce. Graham looked at Reed across the length of that table. When he spoke, his voice was calm, unhurried, and carried the weight of something that had been buried for years and was now, finally, being set down. I designed the seismic resistance system for Kensho Tower in Osaka, 67 floors, still standing after a 7.1 earthquake. You don't need to trust my resume. You just need to look at yours, because all of it is right here. He pointed to the screen behind him. No one in the room moved. No one spoke. A board member at the far end of the table picked up his phone and typed 4 words into a search engine. The results appeared in 3 seconds: international press coverage, engineering journal citations, a photograph of a tower standing intact above a shattered skyline, and the name Graham Aldrich listed as the principal structural designer. The board member set his phone on the table, screen facing up, and stared at Reed. Marcus Hale rose from his chair. His face was drawn, his eyes red, his hands no longer shaking because the worst had already happened, and there was nothing left to fear. Reed forced me to sign the material substitution approval, Marcus said. He told me my career would end if I refused. He told me he would fabricate evidence of prior negligence and use it to have my license revoked. Marcus placed his phone on the conference table and pressed play. Reed's voice filled the room, recorded during a late-night call, explicit and unmistakable, threatening Marcus with destruction if he didn't comply. Reed pushed back from the table and stood. His chair scraped against the floor. He turned toward the door. 2 security officers were already standing there. Noel had called them before the meeting began. Reed was escorted to a private conference room where the company's legal team and a representative from the district attorney's office were waiting. His files were sealed. His access to every Sunderland system was revoked. In a final desperate attempt, Reed pointed at Graham. "That man hasn't held an active engineering license in years. He walked away from the profession. Nothing he says has legal weight." But the evidence wasn't Graham's opinion. It was Sunderland Corp's own internal data system logs, digital signatures, financial records. Reed's argument collapsed under the weight of his own documentation. The full story of Graham Aldrich emerged in the hours that followed, not from Graham himself, who said nothing, but from the public record and from Bryn, who finally broke her silence. Graham had been the lead structural engineer at Thornfield Engineering, one of the most respected structural design firms in the world. Over 12 years, he had designed earthquake-resistant structures on 5 major projects across Japan, South Korea, and the United Arab Emirates. His work on Kensho Tower had been cited in over 40 engineering journals. His name was on patents. His methods were taught in universities. And then his wife Claire Aldrich, also a structural engineer at Thornfield, had been killed when a scaffolding system collapsed at a construction site in the Philippines. An investigation revealed that the contractor had used substandard materials to cut costs. Claire died because someone had chosen cheaper steel. Graham walked away from engineering the same week. He couldn't look at a blueprint without seeing her. He couldn't walk onto a construction site without hearing the sound of metal giving way. He took Josie, who was 4 years old, moved back to Asheville where he had grown up, and took the lowest job in the construction industry, maintenance, as if the only way to survive was to make himself as small as the world had made him feel. Bryn told Noel the rest in the quiet of Noel's private office, with the door closed. "I met Graham at Virginia Tech. We were in the same program. After Claire died, he disappeared. It took me 2 years to find him. When I finally did, he was fixing pipes in the basement of a shopping mall in West Asheville. And he asked me to do one thing: don't tell anyone who I am. That was the only thing he ever asked me for, and I kept that promise until tonight." Noel stood alone after Bryn left. She didn't sit down. She stood at the window and replayed every moment: the dinner where she had looked at his hands and seen nothing worth knowing, the corridor where she had told security to escort him out, the coffee shop where she had called him a maintenance worker to his face. She remembered the way he had walked away each time: no anger, no bitterness, no defense. And she understood now that his silence hadn't been weakness. It had been the discipline of a man who had lost everything and no longer needed anyone to tell him what he was worth. The gala was postponed indefinitely. The Pinnacle project entered a complete structural reassessment of floors 30 through 42. The remediation would cost tens of millions of dollars and push the timeline back by over a year. But the alternative: catastrophic structural failure in a fully occupied building during a major storm, would have cost lives, hundreds of millions in liability, and the complete destruction of the Sunderland name. Graham Aldrich, working alone from a kitchen table with a 7-year-old asleep in the next room, had prevented all of it. Noel found Graham in the hallway as he was leaving the building. His jacket was over his arm. He looked tired. She walked toward him and stopped 2 steps away. "I owe you an apology," she said. Graham looked at her, and for the first time his expression carried something other than control, something close to gentleness. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "You just need to fix that building." He turned and walked toward the elevator. Noel watched him go. For the first time since she had taken over the company, she didn't see a title or a personnel file when she looked at another person. She saw a man. 3 weeks later, the reinforcement work on Sunderland Pinnacle was underway. A new engineering team had been brought in to redesign the structural supports for floors 30 through 42, and Noel was overseeing the process personally. She had changed, not dramatically, not in any way that made headlines, but in the small ways that mattered. She asked more questions and gave fewer orders. She listened to the engineers before she consulted the spreadsheets. She stopped evaluating people by what was written on paper and started paying attention to what they actually did. She found Graham on a Tuesday afternoon, not at the construction site, not at the Ridgeline complex, but at Josie's elementary school. He was leaning against the fence outside the main entrance, waiting for the final bell. Noelle parked across the street and walked toward him. She just stood a few feet away, hands in the pockets of her coat, and waited. The doors opened and Josie came sprinting out, backpack bouncing, a large piece of construction paper flapping in her hand like a flag. She launched herself at Graham's legs. "Daddy, look what I made!" She held up the drawing, a tall building, carefully colored in blue and silver, with a small figure standing on the roof, arms spread wide. "That's you," Josie said proudly, "standing on top of the building you built." Graham crouched down, wrapped his arms around his daughter, and held her against his chest for a long time. Over Josie's shoulder, his eyes were closed. Noelle watched them from a few steps away, and in that moment, standing on a cracked sidewalk in front of a public elementary school, she saw what she had missed from the very beginning: not the engineer, not the maintenance worker, not the resume or the lack of one, but the father. The man who made breakfast every morning, and kissed his daughter's forehead every night, and carried the memory of a woman he loved inside a silence that the rest of the world had mistaken for emptiness. Josie noticed Noelle and tilted her head with the open curiosity of a 7-year-old. "Are you Daddy's friend?" Noelle looked at Graham, then at Josie. A small, careful smile crossed her face. "I hope so," she said softly. Graham and Noelle walked together along the sidewalk, while Josie skipped ahead, drawing invisible buildings in the air with her finger and narrating the design to no one in particular. They didn't talk about the project. They didn't talk about engineering or steel grades or liability. Noelle asked the question that had lived in her chest since the boardroom. "Why didn't you tell anyone who you were?" Graham watched Josie trace the outline of an imaginary skyscraper against the sky, her small hand carving towers out of afternoon light. "Because the person I used to be died with her mother," he said. "I didn't want to go back to that world." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "But maybe I don't have to go back to the old world. Maybe I can build a new one." Noelle offered him a position structural consultant for the Pinnacle remediation, not because he needed the job, but because the project needed him. Graham didn't answer right away. He looked at Josie, who had stopped to examine a crack in the sidewalk with the intensity of someone conducting a geological survey. Then he looked at Noelle. "I'll think about it," he said. That evening, Graham and Josie sat together in their apartment. Josie was on the floor with her crayons, drawing a bridge with a river underneath, her tongue poking out in concentration. Graham reached up to the top shelf of the bookcase and pulled down a leather-bound notebook he hadn't opened in over 3 years. It was an engineering journal. His engineering journal filled with sketches, calculations, and designs that represented the best work of his career. He opened it to a blank page, picked up a pencil, and began to draw. Josie looked up. She set down her crayon, walked over, and peered over his shoulder. Her eyes went wide. "Daddy," she whispered, "you're drawing again." Graham looked at his daughter, and the smile that crossed his face reached all the way to his eyes, the kind of smile that arrives when something inside a person finally unlocks after years of holding still. "Yeah, sweetheart, I'm drawing again." His phone buzzed on the table. A text from Noelle. He picked it up and read the message. "Bryn says she won the bet. I hate agreeing with my sister." Graham looked at the screen for a long moment. A quiet laugh escaped him, small, warm, almost involuntary. The sound of something thawing after a very long winter. On the couch behind him, Josie had fallen asleep with a red crayon still in her hand, and a half-finished bridge stretching across the paper beneath her. Outside the window, the Asheville skyline glowed faintly against the Blue Ridge Mountains. Graham set the phone down, looked at his daughter, looked at the open notebook in front of him, and picked up the pencil again. Neither of them had been looking for this. But sometimes the things that save you don't arrive when you're ready. They arrive in a dare, from a best friend, a dinner you almost refused, and the quiet, steady hands of a man the whole world had learned to overlook.